All right. So, something that's probably on a lot of people's minds right now is the Canadian housing market. I mean, could 2025 be the year that you finally get that place of your own? We're looking at this global news article, and it's got all these predictions for what's going to happen this year. There's new mortgage rules and interest rates going up and down, and expert opinions from all over the place. So we've got a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's interesting because, this is about more than just buying or selling a house. Understanding what's going on in the housing market can really help people make good financial decisions overall, whether they're already in the market or, just thinking about saving up.
Right. Okay. So let's start with, I guess, the biggest news, which is that there's some pretty big changes to the mortgage rules. We're talking like longer, what is it called? Amortization periods, so 30 years instead of 25. And then also a higher price cap for insured mortgages, like way higher. It's $1.5 million now, up from a million.
Yeah. And you know what I think is really interesting about this is how it's going to affect first-time buyers, especially. So just imagine, like, if you're looking at a place that costs like $1.2 million, that new higher price cap, that means your down payment could be $150,000 instead of
Yeah.
$240,000. So, like, for some people, that's almost a whole year's worth of saving.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot of avocado toast you could be eating instead.
Exactly.
So the article is saying that this could be a total game changer, especially in those cities where, it's already so expensive, like Vancouver. And one realtor even said that it could help families who are kind of stuck in condos to finally be able to buy a townhome.
Right. And, that makes sense. But I think we also have to remember that there's always kind of like a flip side to these things. Like this easier access to mortgages,
Hmm.
it could end up, pushing demand even higher. And then that might make prices go up and, offset some of those benefits we were just talking about.
Yeah.
It's always a balance, right? Okay, so let's move on to interest rates because, that's a big one. So the Bank of Canada, they've been lowering rates, and a lot of people are saying that they're going to keep doing that all year. That sounds good, right?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that, actually. So fixed mortgage rates, those are really tied to what's going on in the bond market. And those bond markets are already kind of anticipating those rate cuts. It's almost like the lenders are already factoring those cuts into their calculations, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I think I see what you're saying. So you're saying that even if the Bank of Canada lowers rates even more, fixed mortgage rates might not actually change that much.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
All right, so no huge bargains there, I guess. What
Yeah.
about variable rates, though? Well, the prediction is that variable rates are probably going to keep falling.
Hmm.
So that could be a good thing for some people who are comfortable with a little bit of, you know, fluctuation in their payments. But the thing is, they're still higher than fixed rates right now. So you're not really seeing these like massive savings with variable rates either at the moment.
So it sounds like even though interest rates are going down, it's not going to be this like magical solution to the whole affordability problem.
Right. It's not like suddenly everyone's going to be able to afford a house. And, the other thing is that house prices themselves haven't really gone down all that much either. Affordability is still a really big issue for a lot of Canadians.
Okay, well, let's see what Remax is predicting for this year. So they're saying that overall, we're going to see prices jump by an average of 6% across the whole country. But of course, there's some differences depending on what kind of housing you're talking about. So detached homes, they're expecting those to go up by 7%, which would put the average price at around $900,000. But condos, they're only predicting a 3.5% increase, which would put them at around 605,993.
Yeah, I think that difference between detached homes and condos is really telling. Like it shows you that there's still this huge demand for those detached homes.
Yeah.
But the condo market might be a little bit more, accessible for first-time buyers or people who are looking for something a bit more affordable.
Yeah, maybe. The article also talks about this thing they're calling a psychological factor. Like, if buyers all wait around for rates to get even lower, they might end up competing with even more people later on, and that could push prices back up.
Yeah, that's a really important point. You don't want to miss the boat.
Definitely not. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about this whole condo versus detached home thing. It seems like those are becoming two completely different markets. There are more and more condos being built all the time, so buyers might have more options there and maybe even be able to negotiate a little bit. But detached homes are a different story. There's just not enough of them to meet the demand, and that's keeping prices high.
Yeah, it's like that classic dilemma, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you go for affordability or do you go for that dream of having a detached home with all the space and privacy? Like, are people going to be okay with getting into the market with a condo? Or are they going to push themselves to get that detached home, even if it means Stretching their budget really thin.
Yeah. And how's that all going to play out in 2025? Are we going to see a shift towards more people living in condos? Or are detached homes still going to be like the ultimate goal, even with the affordability challenges and all that?
It's going to be interesting to see how it all unfolds. It's funny that the article really focuses on those big cities. Like, what about those smaller towns and rural areas? I wonder how those trends would be different out there.
Yeah, that's a great point. We always hear about what's happening in Toronto and Vancouver. But what about all those other places that don't get as much attention?
Exactly. Like, could those changes to the mortgage rules have an even bigger impact in places where prices are already lower?
Yeah.
And how is the economy going to affect those regions? Because they're not all relying on the same industries.
Right. It's like there's this whole other layer to this story. Like the national trends are one thing, but each region has its own unique story.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look at the local context, not just what the headlines are saying on a national level.
For sure. Speaking of regional variations, the article did mention that there's some optimism in Vancouver right now. Apparently, one realtor there is seeing a lot more inquiries from buyers. Like, people are really eager to take advantage of those new mortgage rules. So, is Vancouver about to have another boom?
It's hard to say for sure. It could be that this is just a local thing in Vancouver.
Hmm.
Maybe there are some specific factors there that are driving that optimism. But it could also be a sign of a bigger trend across the whole country. Maybe
Yeah.
buyers are feeling more confident now and ready to jump into the market.
Yeah, we'll have to see how it all plays out. Okay, so we've talked about changes to the mortgage rules, interest rates, price predictions, even the overall economic outlook. But there's one more thing from the article that I think we should talk about, and that's the impact of Canada's economy on the housing market.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. The article mentions that Canada's economy has been a bit slow lately, and there's all this uncertainty about those potential trade disputes with the U.S.
Right, and those things can have a ripple effect. Like it can impact jobs, which then affects what happens in the housing market.
Exactly. And it's not just about what might happen in the future. A lot of Canadians are already facing these mortgage renewals at much higher rates than they had before. So that's going to affect how much money they have to spend, which then impacts the whole economy.
So it sounds like there are all these factors that could make the market really unpredictable. It's not just about interest rates and demand, it's about those bigger forces in the economy.
Yeah, and one expert in the article actually said that instead of a boom or a bust, we might end up with this kind of boring flat period for a while.
Boring doesn't sound very exciting, but maybe that's a good thing.
It could be. Maybe it'll be a time for things to stabilize a bit,
Mm-hmm.
which could actually be good for both buyers and sellers. Like buyers could have more time to make decisions without feeling like they have to rush because the market is changing so fast.
That makes sense. So with all of this in mind, what do you think is the most important thing for listeners to remember as they try to figure out this whole housing market situation?
Hmm, that's a good question. I guess I would say that knowledge is power. The more you understand about what's driving the market, the better decisions you'll be able to make, whether you're buying, selling, or just trying to stay informed.
Definitely. It's about being proactive and informed instead of just reacting to whatever you see in the headlines.
Exactly. You have to take control of your own housing journey, whatever that looks like for you.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this part of our deep dive into the Canadian housing market. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon with more insights and analysis.
It really highlights that age-old question for home buyers, affordability versus that dream of having all that space and privacy. I mean, are people going to say, okay, I'm good with getting into the market with a condo? Or are they going to try to get that detached home, even if it means like really, really stretching their budget?
Yeah. And how do you think that's going to play out this year? Are we going to see more people going for condos? Or are detached homes still going to be like the top choice, even with, all the challenges of affordability?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the answer could really change things this year. It's interesting that the article mostly talks about those big cities. Like, what about smaller towns and rural area? I wonder if it's different there.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. We always hear about like the crazy housing market in Toronto and Vancouver, but what about those other places that don't get as much attention?
Exactly. Like, do you think those changes to the mortgage rules would have a bigger impact in places where prices are already lower? And then how would those economic factors we talked about affect those regions?
Hmm.
Because they all have different industries and stuff.
Right. It's like there's a whole other side to this story that we don't always hear about.
Totally. And that's why it's so important to think about the local situation, not just what's happening across the whole country.
For sure. Speaking of different regions, the article did mention that there's some optimism in Vancouver. One realtor is saying that they're getting a lot more calls from buyers. It sounds like people are ready to jump in and take advantage of those new mortgage rules. So does that mean Vancouver is going to have another boom?
Well, it's tough to say. It might just be a Vancouver thing. Like maybe there's
Yeah.
something going on there specifically that's making people feel optimistic. But it could also be, you know, the start of a bigger trend. Like maybe buyers across Canada are feeling more confident about the market now.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Okay, so we've covered mortgage changes and interest rates and price predictions and even like the overall economic outlook. But there's one more thing from the article that I think is worth talking about, and that's the impact of how Canada's economy is doing on the housing market.
Right. That's a big one. I mean, the article mentions that Canada's economy hasn't doing so great lately. And then there's all that uncertainty about those trade disputes with the U.S.
Yeah, and that stuff can have a domino effect. It can affect jobs, which then affects how active the housing market is.
Exactly. And it's not just about what might happen in the future.
Mm.
Like a lot of Canadians are already having to renew their mortgages at way higher rates than they used to have. So that means they have less money to spend on other things. And that affects the whole economy.
So it sounds like there are all these different things that could make the housing market really unpredictable. It's not as simple as just looking at interest rates and demand.
Yep.
It's about the big picture of the economy.
One of the experts in the article said that instead of having a boom or a bust, we might just end up with this like boring flat period for a while.
Boring doesn't sound very exciting.
No, not really, but it might be a good thing in a way.
Like maybe it would give the market a chance to stabilize a bit.
Exactly. And that could be good for everyone. Like buyers would have more time to think things through and make decisions without feeling rushed, and sellers wouldn't have to worry about prices dropping suddenly.
That makes sense. So thinking about all of this, what's like the one key takeaway you would give to our listeners? Like, what's the most important thing for them to remember as they try to figure out what's going on in the housing market?
Hmm, that's a tough one. I guess I would say just remember that the more you know, the better. Like the more you understand about what's driving the market, the better decisions you'll be able to make, whether you're thinking about buying or selling or just, keeping up with what's going on.
Totally. It's all about being proactive and getting informed, not just reacting to the headlines or whatever.
Exactly. You got to take charge of your own housing journey.
I love that. Take charge of your own housing journey. So, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this part of our deep dive into the Canadian housing market. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with more insights and analysis.
Okay, so we've covered like a ton of ground today, starting with those mortgage rule changes and interest rates. We talked about different parts of the country and the economy and everything. But like at the end of the day, it all comes down to one question. Is 2025 going to be the year that you buy a place in Canada?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And like we've been saying, there's no easy answer. It's complicated.
Totally.
Yeah.
But I think what we've done today is give you like the tools and the info you need to figure it out for yourself. It's all about understanding what's happening and then making smart choices that work for your situation and your goals.
Right. And don't forget that you don't have to do this alone. There are people who can help you figure this stuff out, like real estate agents and financial advisors. And there are tons of resources online, too, like websites and groups and stuff. Yeah, definitely. And don't be afraid to do your own research, like we talked about those regional differences. So dig into that. Talk to experts in your area and get a sense of what's happening in your specific market.
It just occurred to me that we've been mostly talking about buying, but all this stuff is just as important for people who are thinking about selling their homes this year. If you understand these trends, you can set realistic expectations and maybe even time your sale better to get the best results.
That's a great point. Whether you're buying or selling knowledge is key.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to that thought you had earlier about smaller towns and rural areas. Do you think those trends would play out differently there?
Right? Like, could those mortgage rule changes make it easier for people to get into the market in those areas?
And how would those economic factors we talked about affect those regions? It's almost like a whole other layer to this housing market puzzle.
Yeah, it really shows you that there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Exactly. The Canadian housing market is so diverse and it's always changing.
So, like, as you continue on your housing journey, whether you're actively searching or just starting to save or even just trying to stay informed, remember this, the Canadian housing market in 2025 is like a story waiting to be written, and you have the power to write your own chapter.
I love that. You're in control.
Exactly. And by staying informed and being proactive and finding the right resources, you can navigate this market with confidence and make choices that really work for you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us and happy house hunting, everyone.